Hello and welcome. My name is Natasha Nickel, and I have shared a short summary of my professional background at the end of these slides. The title of my presentation is Using a Just Culture Algorithm to Assess Employee Behaviors. This is the relevant financial relationship disclosure for this presentation. These are the learning objectives that will be addressed during this presentation. These are the key abbreviations that will be used in this presentation. This is a definition that will be helpful during this presentation. We'll begin with a self-assessment question. Utilization of an algorithm to assess employee behaviors promotes a just culture as it facilitates standardization of how employees are treated after an event. Do you believe this is true or false? Later on in the presentation, we'll return back to this question and I'll provide the answer and we'll talk about the rationale. Here's another question to get us thinking about this topic. Cognitive biases can lead to misuse of the tools and algorithms available for managing risk in an organization justly. Is this true or false? And again, we'll come back to this later. I'll give you the answer and we'll talk about why that is the answer. Well, I'm not going to start things out easily because the first step is really tough. To blind your biases. We all have biases, whether you think you do or you don't. Based upon your experiences, the way you were raised, where you grew up, everything determines our biases. So what we need to do before you can use an algorithm, before you decide how you're going to treat employees, you need to perform this following mental test. So replace the individual involved with someone else who works in the same area, same domain of activity, and has comparable qualifications and experience. So take person A and remove them who is involved in the event and place another person who does the same job, same qualifications, same experience. And that is really, really difficult. So what this means is you need to think about whether or not this could have happened to another person also. You need to judge the employee against other reasonable people. That's the term we use, other reasonable people. Some people struggle with this because we were raised and society pretty much promotes that focusing on the person that made the mistake and not the system is more comfortable. That's pretty much the way we were raised. It's pretty much how we think about things. So doing this little mental test, it really helps you focus on the system more than the person. And people are also kind of uncomfortable with this because they worry it's going to swing too far. And we won't look at individuals that are really not a good fit or truly may not even be qualified to do the tasks they've been assigned or the things we're looking at. This is not the intent of a just culture. Keep in mind, even repetitive human errors must be addressed. So we're not saying it's okay. We're not saying more than anything, you have to be able to think in your head, not just about that one individual person, but could it happen to someone else? So in light of how the events unfolded and were perceived by those individuals in real time, is it likely that this new individual would have behaved any differently? Again, these are all the questions you need to ask yourself and make sure that you're removing the biases before you begin to look at the algorithm. And finally, given the circumstances that prevailed at the time, could you be sure that you would have not committed the same or similar type of unsafe act? And again, people are really uncomfortable with this, but this is something that we need to work towards and try to master in order to ensure that we treat all employees justly. And yes, I bet you didn't expect this. I am going to quote our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this, quite frankly, is our highest duty and obligation in life as human beings. This means not only do we have the right to our own rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but it also means everyone else does. So we're held to this highest duty of not infringing on someone else's rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in our own pursuit. Really interesting to think about, the higher duty. The whole concept of justice, and remember, that's what we're talking about, a just culture, super complex, not just in society, but in the workplace too. We face so many overlapping duties, demands for our time, our attention, and all the things that we have to deal with in life. And we need to acknowledge that no system is perfect, just like no human is perfect. We need to shift from focusing on errors and outcomes to system design and employee behavioral choices. And we need to be aware of our own personal performance shaping factors so that we understand how we work best, the things that impact our ability to work our best and make good behavioral choices. This is an example of a just culture algorithm. And the purpose of the algorithm is to determine which behavior was evident after an event occurs. Was it human error? Was it at-risk behavior? Was it reckless? Remember, reckless is going to be very, very rare, particularly in healthcare. If you go through the algorithm and determine that reckless behavior was the response, highly recommend you start over and be 100% sure that's where you want to go. Because reckless, remember, is that you have completely disregarded an unjustifiable risk. You've decided, I knew it was going to hurt the patient, but I did it anyway. Now, what we do with the algorithm, you begin in the upper left, and this algorithm in particular relates to that higher duty, the duty to avoid causing unjustifiable risk or harm. We begin with asking the question, was it the employee's purpose to cause harm? If we said yes, that would lead to reckless behavior, and then it tells you what the recommended response is with the employee. Consider punitive action. If we determine that no, it was not the employee's purpose to cause harm, we move to the next question, did the employee knowingly cause harm? Then we move to yes or no, and that branches out from there. So we'll spend more time on each of these in some activities later on. But more than anything, we need to remove those biases, focus on the behaviors, not on the outcome. Meaning, if the event resulted in patient death or the event resulted in the patient being fine, that is not a factor in determining where we go with the algorithm or how we treat the employee. The outcome does not determine the behavior. The behavior is what we need to focus on. Within the algorithm and the higher duty to avoid causing unjustifiable risk or harm, these are the questions that we need to ask and we need to answer minus the bias. So it asks the question primarily, did the employee put an organizational interest or value in harm's way? A good example, a lesser of two evils, for instance. An employee is passing by a patient's room. You can tell a patient's about to fall, but policy states you cannot enter a patient's room unless you wash or disinfect your hands. If this was the event and the breach that occurred was the employee not washing their hands so that they could take care of a patient and make sure that patient did not fall, that is not something you're going to punish an employee for. For choosing to prevent a patient from falling, you would support the employee in that decision. So this duty supersedes all other duties when we look to determine which behavior was exhibited when a breach occurs. While we all are constantly held to that higher duty of avoiding causing unjustifiable risk or harm, we can break it out into two other duties also. One, duty to follow a procedural rule, and then the other one, duty to produce an outcome. So under the procedural rule duty, this is a system that is largely controlled by the employer. So the employee works within a system and must be a reliable component within that system. These are the questions that you ask. Was the rule known? Was it possible to follow the rule? Did the employee knowingly violate the rule? And then we ask the question, did the benefit of the rule violation exceed the risk? This is when we would support an employee in a decision. Did the employee have a good faith but mistaken belief that the violation was insignificant or justified? These are all questions when it was a procedural rule that we determined was breached. With the duty to follow a procedural rule, you, the employee, are a component within a system, and therefore you're only to follow the rules. The employee is held accountable to being a compliant component of the system. And here's some examples. Requirement to label blood at the patient's bedside. Requirement to follow CDC hand washing guidelines. Pharmacy technicians that utilize scanning feature when restocking automated dispensing cabinets is another procedural rule, meaning the employer said you shall scan a drug before you restock it into an automated dispensing cabinet. The technician is not responsible for determining how that happens. We've told them the rule is you scan it before you put it in. Another one, pharmacy staff following 797 guidelines when compounding. We're under the duty to follow a procedural rule in which the employee is told how to achieve the outcome that the employer is looking for. In a duty to produce an outcome, the system is largely controlled by the employee. So the employee will be held accountable as directed by the code of conduct and the policies of the organization. So the employee knows the outcome is expected, but they're not told how to achieve that outcome specifically. Essentially, they control their own destiny. So the questions you would ask here: was the duty known? Was it possible to produce the outcome? Did the social benefit of the breach exceed the risk? And is the rate of failure within expectations? Meaning, for any employee, would we expect this number of times for a breach to occur? I'll give you some examples on the next slide. In a duty to produce an outcome, getting to work on time is a fantastic example. The employer doesn't tell the employee how to get to work on time. It's just expected that you get to work on time. Then you have to ask the question, did they arrive late because they helped someone in the parking lot who fell, or because the line in the car wash was too long? Was it to society's benefit why they were late? So if you're helping someone who fell in the parking lot, I think we can all agree that yes, that benefited society. Are they late to work because the line at the car wash was really long and they didn't want to go after work? Absolutely not. That is not an acceptable breach of duty. So you need to find out if the breach of duty was justified or not. Another example to produce an outcome, wearing your ID badge. We expect everyone to come to work with an ID badge on. Now, when that breach occurs, you have to ask, was it possible to produce the outcome? Now, for instance, let's say the employee didn't wear the badge because their house burned down last night and the badge was in the house. Absolutely, that is not something we're going to give an employee a hard time about. So if the breach of duty is unjustified, that's when we need to ask, was the rate of failure expected? If yes, meaning, yeah, a few times a year people are going to forget their badge, then we accept that outcome. If no, if this employee forgets their badge 4 out of 5 days in the week, then what we need to do is help the employee produce better outcomes, or if it continues, that's when we can consider punitive action. Because we can set standards and say it's acceptable for this number of times compared to a reasonable individual, it may happen. But if you exceed that threshold, it's not okay and it's not permissible. So with the duty to produce an outcome, the employee is in control of the system, and therefore it is just to hold the employee accountable for the outcome. It's very important to be self-aware. Cognitive biases can really mess up your work to create a just culture. It leads to misuse of an algorithm because you potentially could walk into a session with your team, you're about to run an employee through the algorithm, and you already believe, or you believe that this employee acted in a certain way because your biases are telling you that. And this will likely lead you to go through the algorithm with a conclusion really you may falsely already believe. So it's going to force you to go to, yes, it was definitely reckless because you have biases about this person. That's why it's so important to make sure that you check your biases at the door and ensure that you have a conversation with the group that's taking an employee through the algorithm to make sure those biases are not impacting the way you look at the algorithm and the way you utilize it. I freely admit that this is the impossible slide. Eliminating biases is extremely difficult because it takes a lot of introspection. So, a few different kinds of bias that we deal with. Confirmation bias, where we see what we expect to see or what we want to see because it confirms our beliefs. It happens all the time. Severity bias, that's where we allow the outcome to determine our conclusions about both behavioral choices and system failure. And that happens a lot with, the big, bad, ugly events that happen, patient death versus, oh, it was a near miss. We absolutely walk in thinking, oh, this person deserves to be punished much more because the patient was harmed versus not harmed. And that's really tough to get away from. But in order for an employee to be treated justly and for us to really be able to look at those system changes, design, and understand what happened, we cannot allow severity bias to get in the way. And then attribution bias. This is a tendency to explain a person's behavior by referring to their character rather than any situational factors. Example, saying they're lazy. And so that we attribute, well, that's why that happened. It's because they're lazy. And that is not helpful at all. I love this picture. I travel all the time for my job. I took this in the Atlanta airport. And let's talk about confirmation bias here. What do you see in the clouds? I imagine people have different things that they see. Well, I see an airplane in the middle of two angels. And I decided to allow my confirmation bias to choose that because it was taken this picture, the day after the fatal crash of the military helicopter and regional jet in Washington, D.C. While these are not, all these biases are really not conscious or purposeful, they exist. But that's why it's so important to address any potential biases and keep them top of mind while you're using the algorithm. Otherwise, we cannot treat employees justly, and it doesn't work for just culture. Let's have some fun now and work on a practice case. A nurse came to the pharmacy department window asking for potassium for her patient. The pharmacy technician who responded to the request was still in training. She went to the shelves and found a vial of potassium chloride. The pharmacist working in the main pharmacy had already yelled at the new pharmacy technician twice that day for interrupting him, so she didn't want to bother him again. The pharmacy technician handed the vial to the nurse, asking if that was the correct drug, believing the nurse could be the second check. The nurse administered the IV potassium push, and the patient expired. So where's the duty breach, and what type of breach do you believe occurred here? We'll focus on the technician for this one, though in reality, we would also take the pharmacist and the nurse through the algorithm as well. But regarding the pharmacy technician, was it a breach of duty to avoid causing unjustifiable risk or harm? What is a breach of the duty to follow a procedural rule or a breach of the duty to produce an outcome? In this case, the pharmacy technician breached the duty to follow a procedural rule. And that procedural rule being that a pharmacist must verify a medication before a technician releases it. Take a minute to look at the algorithm for a duty to follow a procedural rule and take the technician through this algorithm and determine what type of behavior you believe the technician exhibited. On the next slide, we'll give the answer. So next we would take the pharmacy technician through the algorithm for procedural rule. Starting in the upper left, was a duty to follow a rule known to the employee? Yes, the pharmacy technician did know that they were to get all drugs checked by a pharmacist before handing it out of the pharmacy. So we go to yes. The next question, was it possible to follow the rule? Yes, the technician could have interrupted the pharmacist and gotten the drug checked. Did the employee knowingly violate the rule? Yes, we know that the technician made the conscious decision because the technician was afraid to interrupt the pharmacist because having already been yelled at twice that day? Did the social benefit of the breach exceed the risk? And we would say no. When we say no, it leads us to, did the employee have a good faith but mistaken belief that the violation was insignificant or justified? Now here is where we would say, well, this employee did not have the thought in their mind, I don't care if it hurts a patient. What they said was, you know what? I believe that I could have the nurse do the second check and everything will be okay. And this perfectly defines good faith but mistaken belief that the violation was insignificant or justified. So that leads us to at-risk behavior. And the proper way of dealing with at-risk behavior is we coach the employee and we conduct an at-risk behavior investigation. And naturally, that will extend to the pharmacist who is working, that will extend to the nurse. There was not just one thing that led to this error. There were multiple things. Let's do another practice case. The security department manager arrived at work without his badge or master key set, which is a requirement. When asked why he did not have his badge or keys, he revealed that his house caught on fire last night and the fire department would not allow anyone to enter the house yet due to fear the structure isn't safe. His badge and keys are still in the house. So where's the duty breach here? And you may recall I might have mentioned this as an example earlier. So what type of breach? Was it a breach of duty to avoid causing unjustifiable risk or harm, the higher duty? Was it a breach of the duty to follow a procedural rule? Or was it a breach of duty to produce an outcome? This is an example of a duty to produce an outcome breach. So the security manager did not bring his badge or keys to work. Remember that in the duty to produce an outcome, the employee largely controls the system. We don't tell the employee how to make sure he brings his badge and keys to work. We just set the expectation that he must. So it is up to that employee to determine how to make sure that that is indeed the outcome. Now that we've identified that the breach was in the duty to produce an outcome, take that employee through the algorithm, and on the next slide, we'll give the response. Now that we've determined that the employee was in breach of duty to produce an outcome, let's take him through the algorithm. Beginning in the upper left, was a duty to produce an outcome known to the employee? We all agree, yes. That employee knew he was to bring his badge and his keys to work. Was it possible to produce the outcome? When we find out that his house burned and the fire department will not allow anyone back into the house, we answer no, it was not possible for him to get his keys and his badge. Therefore, we will investigate the circumstances leading to impossibility. That impossibility meaning it was not possible for that employee to produce the outcome of bringing his badge and keys to work. Even if we decided to move to the next question, say, yeah, he could have produced the outcome, we still would come to the same response. Did the social benefit of the breach exceed the risk? And we will say yes, because he may have been injured or killed had he entered the building, and also potentially put individuals from the fire department at risk because they would have come after him to try to take care of him. So there we will support the employee in the decision. Practice makes perfect, so let's do it again. You're walking in the hallway of 4 North, your busiest postoperative orthopedics unit, when you see a patient getting up from their bed by themselves. You can tell they're about to fall. You know this patient is a fall risk and was readmitted for a postoperative infection from a procedure 2 weeks ago. You know you are not supposed to enter the patient's room without washing or sanitizing your hands, but you run in anyway. You make it to the patient in time to avoid a fall. So where is the duty breach here? What type of breach do you believe it was? Was it a breach of duty, that higher duty, to avoid causing unjustifiable risk or harm? Was it a breach of the duty to follow a procedural rule? Or was it a breach of duty to produce an outcome? In this case, the breach is a duty to follow a procedural rule. In this case, this employee did not follow the rule of washing or sanitizing hands prior to entering a patient's room. Knowing that this employee has breached the duty to follow a procedural rule, take them through the algorithm, and we'll review the correct answers on the next slide. You'll find that the more you do these, you'll become much more comfortable with this and it'll seem second nature. So let's go ahead and review this employee. Upper left was a duty to follow a rule known to the employee. Yes, this employee knew that they were supposed to wash or sanitize their hands before entering a patient's room. Was it possible to follow the rule? We'll say yes, the employee could have stopped and sanitized their hands, washed their hands before they went into the room. Did the employee knowingly violate the rule? I think we can all agree, yes, the employee knew I'm supposed to wash my hands, but I'm not. I'm running in the room. Now, did the social benefit of the breach exceed the risk? I think we all can agree, absolutely. He saved that patient from a fall, which could have resulted in harm. So we will support that employee in their decision to violate the rule. We've recognized, yes, it's a procedural rule that we require of all employees, but when you made a conscious decision and a behavioral choice to violate the rule because that higher duty to prevent unjustifiable risk or harm, and you chose to save a patient from harm instead of following a procedural rule, absolutely, we're going to support your decision. If it did not exceed social benefit and risk ratio, then we would not support you. Let's do one more practice case. You're in the grocery store and overhear the hospital's human resources manager discussing one of your coworkers with another person you don't recognize. You hear the human resources manager talking about how your coworker's husband attempted suicide last week, so they are giving her some time off. She continues to say how awful the whole ordeal is, how bad she feels for your coworker, and wishes there was something she could do to help. You walk away in shock as you had no idea that it happened. Now, where is the duty breach here, and what type of breach do you believe this is? Was it a breach of duty to avoid causing unjustifiable risk or harm, our higher duty? Was it a breach of the duty to follow a procedural rule, or a breach of duty to produce an outcome? I'll admit this could potentially be considered a bit of a trick question. Now, number one, the duty to avoid causing unjustifiable risk or harm, the higher duty was violated here. Personal information was revealed by the human resources manager. We also could say that we believe this was a breach of the duty to follow a procedural rule, as every hospital has policies against revealing patient information when it is not in the course of work or necessary in order to provide for the patient. The good news is it really is okay if you choose to put an employee through the algorithm for the higher duty or through a procedural rule. You're still going to end up with the same response. The same behavioral choice will reveal itself. Take a minute now and take that employee through the Just Culture algorithm, the higher duty to avoid causing unjustifiable risk or harm, and we'll discuss the answer on the next slide. Beginning with this algorithm in the upper left, was it the employee's purpose to cause harm? Now, the HR manager was not revealing information because she's an evil person, and it wasn't with malice or the thoughts to advance her career in some way or something like that. Of course, I'm sure there are some organizations whose policies are very strict about this, and perhaps this is something that is cause for immediate dismissal. But we'll take the employee through the Just Culture algorithm in a sense that we know that they were not acting with malice. So was it the employee's purpose to cause harm? No. Did the employee knowingly cause harm? No, it was not a purposeful thing. Did the behavior represent a substantial and unjustifiable risk? If we say yes, we'll say, think about it, this did not need to occur. If we say yes, Did the employee consciously disregard the substantial and unjustifiable risk? If we said yes to that, then we are suggesting, again, that this person acted with malice and was using this information in some way to hurt someone or perhaps to help herself. And we do not believe that is the intention of this employee's revealing information about someone. So we'll say no. That brings us to, should the employee have known that they were taking a substantial and unjustifiable risk? Yes, absolutely. This is something that is well known. It is not okay to share patient information. Did the employee choose the behavior? Yes. This leads us to at-risk behavior. In this instance, we would coach this employee and conduct an at-risk behavioral investigation. So at-risk behavior, we're going to take a look and understand why did this employee feel that it was okay to do this, because this is a behavioral choice that increases risk where the risk was not even recognized or mistakenly believed to be justified. Let's go back to our self-assessment questions. Utilization of an algorithm to assess employee behaviors promotes a just culture as it facilitates standardization of how employees are treated after an event. What do you think, true or false? The answer is true. When we have an algorithm that every employee is put through, we can be sure that everyone is treated the same, fairly, and justly. And our second question, cognitive biases can lead to misuse of the tools and algorithms available for managing risk in an organization justly. What do you think after hearing this presentation, true or false? The answer is true. In order for us to approach use of an algorithm and treat every employee fairly and justly, we must remove those biases. Again, it is not easy, but if we work as a group and it's a trained group in how to use an algorithm, it becomes easier to be able to look at all employees the same way and not individualize people so that they are not treated the same as anyone else would be treated. Some key points we talked about. Utilization of an algorithm to assess staff behaviors following a safety event promotes a just culture. Cognitive biases should be acknowledged, addressed, and avoided. And focusing on managing system design and behavioral choices will lead to improved safety. These are the references used to develop this presentation. Thank you for your time and participation.